Hi everyone, so I am Closer's Metadata Officer, and like Will said, I'm going to give an insight into documenting metadata using DDI. So this is just a brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. So what metadata are we documenting, what DDI is, Closer's challenges and solutions, what our setup is, what we've learned during this process, and then some conclusions. So this is, I guess, a bit of a recap from what Will mentioned in his presentation. This is the metadata that we're documenting from high level to low level. So starting from the high level, we document a study, which includes metadata like the PI, the abstract, universe, and this is all this metadata can be seen on Closer Discovery, which Will showed before. Within that, we have the sweep metadata, which is similar to the study but has things like life stage in there. Within that, we have the instrument level metadata, and this is twofold. Firstly, we have the metadata about the collection itself, like the mode of collection, who did the data collection, and when it went out in the field. And we have the metadata about the questionnaire themselves. So what was on the questionnaire, like the questions, response domains, instructions. Then we have the dataset level, and this includes things like the variable names, the frequency values, and the descriptive statistics. And then lastly, we have the linkages, and this is metadata linkages as opposed to data linkages. This is the metadata for mapping between these questions and variables, as well as mapping those to the topics that were also mentioned before. So I'll briefly go through how we document each of these levels of metadata. If we start from the top, the study and sweep, this is generally quite small in size and is quite straightforward once you have that information. And so we document this by entering it straight into Collectica software, which is a externally bought DDI editor. In terms of the data set, this is generally quite straightforward to document as well, because most studies have their data in standardized formats, like SPSS data files, and so we can strip out this metadata automatically using software like Sledgehammer. And then the linkages or the mappings are done manually, and usually the study does that through some bespoke software that we have. And lastly, the instrument level metadata. This is where the bulk of the metadata documentation comes in. And is the most complex part. And this is what I'm going to be concentrating on today. So we're documenting all this metadata in DDI. So I'll just briefly go over what DDI is, in case you don't know. So it stands for Data Documentation Initiative. It's a set of standards or specifications for social science data. It's a tag structure in XML, so it means it's understandable from computers and humans. It covers high-level and low-level metadata, as previously mentioned, plus much more. It's maintained and updated. It's widely supported and adopted because it's an international standard. And it aids interoperability. So the more people that use this DDI standard, the easier it is to share between groups and have this secondary data use. So moving on to what challenges that Closer's had, one of the biggest challenges we've had is just the scale of the metadata we have. So we have 8 studies. Within that we have 81 sweeps. Within that we have 319 prioritized instruments. This equates to about 12,000 pages, or about 100,000 questions. So it's quite a big chunk of work if you want to imagine what 12,000 pages looks like physically. I don't know if anyone's read War and Peace. It was quite big, and then imagine 10 of those, and then imagine that in questionnaire data, and then try and enter it into using DDI. So it's quite a big lot of work. Another challenge that we have is the variety of questionnaires. So as mentioned before, we're funded by the ESRC and the MRC, so we have this mix of aims and the questionnaires. We also have a wide time frame of about 80 years, so the questionnaires have obviously changed a lot over that time period. We have cohorts and a panel survey. We also have regional and national studies. We have computer-aided interviews and paper-based questionnaires, and we also have other data collection types. So we mostly have self-completion questionnaires, but we also have tests and clinical forms. One of the challenges is DDI itself because of its complexity. It has over 1,000 different elements, and you really need to be an expert to understand DDI, and this is just a snip of some of the XML from one of the instruments. We've entered just a tiny bit to show you what it looks like. Another challenge we have is related to computers. So many of the questionnaires we have were designed and distributed before computers were available. And so we have no machine logic or readable copies. And there's not much consistency or repeatability in the questionnaires. So there's not many patterns that traditional computers can recognize. And it is really complex as well. It's complex. So for these reasons that we have to do most of this work manually. So when we do get computers, then we start to get computer-based questionnaires. And this means we get a lot more questions. We'll have thousands of questions and hundreds of pages worth. But it does mean that there is potential for this machine-readable and actionable code to be used. So one of the challenges in itself is doing this manual data entry. So we need to ensure that while we're doing this, we can maintain consistency, accuracy, and high quality whilst we're doing this. So it is really repetitive work, but it also is complex, and this is the bulk of the work that we do. So staffing is the biggest expenditure of the project doing this work. If we move on to the solutions that Closer uses, in terms of maintaining the high quality and consistency, we have this workflow of entry and verification. So one of our metadata assistants will enter the questionnaire, and then another member of the team will then verify it, check it for consistency and accuracy. And then once we're happy, it goes to the study, who will then review it and make sure that it's accurate and they're happy with the interpretation that we've made. Another way of ensuring this high quality is through the principles of archiving metadata. These are like the golden rules that we try and come back to while we're documenting the data. So the first two principles, 0 and 1, are the most important and should be maintained all the time. Principles 2 to 4 can be broken in special circumstances when it means we're maintaining the first and 0 principle. So the principle 0 is that the documentation must make sense, and principle 1 is to maintain the semantic meaning of the questionnaire. So these might seem obvious, but documenting this questionnaires is not as straightforward as copying the text from the paper into digital form. It's more nuanced than that. So if you imagine you have several people entering a questionnaire, each one is going to come up with their own interpretation of how it should be entered for different reasons. So an example of this would be if I wanted to represent an arrow on a questionnaire, I might want to add extra text that's not included on the questionnaire. But then someone else might think, well, you're changing the questionnaire too much, you're improving it, for example. So we would go back to these rules and think, if I add this text, I'm going to break rule 3, which is only document what's there. But then if I don't add this text, I'm going to be breaking the 0 principle, which is the documentation must make sense. And so this is how the decision process works. Another way of helping with the decision-making process is the Closer Technical Wiki. So this is an online set of documentation protocols that is available for people to use. And I will just give you a quick tour of it now. So it's a work in progress, and so it is going to be constantly improved and built upon. And it is being designed and documented by the metadata team. So its aim is for both technical users and also for users who are more interested in closer discovery itself. So if I was interested, for example, in knowing what content was in closer discovery as a user, I could come here and find out what's in discovery and what's planned to be in. I don't know if you can see that. It might be a bit better. I don't think the colour resolution's that good, but the green's in and the red's to be added. Someone using closer discovery might also be interested in the controlled vocabularies that we use, that Will mentioned previously about the topics. And here we have definitions of all the 100 or so topics that we use. And then we also have a bit of information about the DDI profiles that we use that I mentioned about the study and sweep. So this includes some of the metadata that is required. And it's got the standards there. The bulk of the information is contained within the how-to. I'm conscious my head is in the way now. Is in the how-to. And documents questionnaire. And this contains everything that you need to know in order to document a questionnaire from scratch. So it's got some real basics on how to split up a questionnaire into its elements and its components. So how you break that down into more complicated things like routing and logic and how you would go about doing that. Most of the pages have a lot of examples to show what to do in different situations and how they relate to real questionnaires and what they look like in the software once it's been entered. And lastly, the solution we have is Archivist, and this is the specialist design software by Will in order to actually do the documentation. It overcomes the problem or the challenge of DDI itself because it uses a subset of DDI known as the questionnaire profile. So it means that you don't have to be an expert in DDI in order to do this documentation. It's simple to use and to learn. It's got continuous improvements being made to it. It's a web application, so anyone can use it. And the database itself is centralized and it's built for large scale. And this is an example of what one of the pages looks like. And you can see the different questionnaire elements that are used to build up the final questionnaire, as this is the build view. So what is our setup? So over the past 3 years, we've had between 2 and 5 metadata assistants and 1 metadata officer. And we've been centralized for that time. And this is to ensure we have this high quality and consistency with the metadata entry, so we can have group discussions and come up with the best ways to enter the data. It's also been really important for developing the protocols. So these protocols that we've developed, which are on the wiki, suit all of the studies in the project, as opposed to just being concentrated on one of the studies. We're currently working towards decentralizing the team so that the documentation will take place at the studies instead, so they can continue documentation forwards. What have we achieved so far? So we've entered about 77% of our instruments so far, which is about half of the pages and half of the questions still to go, because most of what we have left are the computer-aided interviews, so they have a lot more pages and questions. What have we learned during this time? So I've got some rough estimates of how long it takes to enter a questionnaire and to enter a study. So firstly, for a paper questionnaire, a person can enter about 2 pages a day. So for an average questionnaire, it will take you about 8 days. For a small study like HCS, which has about 20 questionnaires, each questionnaire has about 5 pages in it, it would take you 1-2 months to enter. And for a large study like ALSPAC, which has over 100 questionnaires, each questionnaire has about 25 pages, then it takes several years for it to be entered by one person. So what are the influencing factors affecting these rates? They're related, I've broken this down into 2 factors, which are the team and the questionnaires themselves. So if we start and look at the team, this figure on the y-axis shows the pages per day that can be entered, and this is just for paper questionnaires, and this is grouped by metadata assistant. You can see there's a wide range in rates that can be entered, from 1 page a day up to nearly 7 pages per day. And so it's really important that you recruit the right people for this work. So our metadata assistants are on a grade 5, and this is to reflect the fact that it's not just straightforward data entry, it is complex. And so you need to make sure they have the right training and skills to do the job. The key factor affecting the rate of entry seems to be computer skills and how well they are on that. Other key skills are related to problem solving and accuracy. In terms of the characteristics of the person, someone who is an analyzer, an organizer will suit the job. And it's important that they have motivation to develop and improve because of the verification process that we go through. They get a lot of feedback and changes to be made to their work in order for this consistency to happen. And in terms of motivation and retention, people who are achievement driven will get more out of the job, and people with social science background will have more buy-in into the project. In terms of the questionnaires, this is a similar figure to the previous one, except this time it's grouped by study. And you can see again, there's a range of rates depending on the study, from over 3 pages per day, then less than 1. And this is because we have this massive variation between what each of these pages looks like. So we've got an Understanding Society questionnaire on the left, which has not got that many questions, quite simple, straightforward to enter. And then on the right, there's an NCDS, which has got a lot more questions, but it's also a lot more complicated because it's got a lot of conditions and routing in there, so it takes a lot longer to enter. So then I tried to think of ways in which to predict how long it was going to take to enter a questionnaire. So I've drawn up some correlations between the days it takes to enter along with some of the questionnaire characteristics. The first thing to note is that all the correlations are significant, but they're generally quite weak. And this could be partly because of the different rates in metadata assistance. So the weakest relationship was with pages, and this is because of the, as I've shown previously, there's massive variation in what can be on a page. The strongest correlation is with the number of links between the response domains and questions. Unfortunately, we can't really use that as a predictor on how long it's going to take, because we don't really know that until after we've entered the questionnaire. So the most useful thing might be to look at the pages and then maybe add in how many questions you've got as well and try and work it out from there. Or you could start from a basis of what the average questionnaire contains and then increase or decrease the average from that. So if we look at how we would do this, we could say that the more pages, questions, conditions and code lists you have, the slower it's going to take you to enter. If you have more repeatable code lists, more text that can be copied and pasted, so a lot of the questionnaires are so old that we're having to type these in by hand. If you have more grids and more simple loops, that will speed it up as well. So lastly, I've done like examples of like typical studies that represent the different speeds of rates of entry. And I thought we could compare them and and that you will be able to compare them to the studies that you're working with to see which one is most like the one that you have experience with. So the first one is the RED study, which here is represented by Alsbach. It started in the 90s, so it's quite recent. The rate of entry is 3 pages per day, so it's a bit faster, but it has got more pages, about 24 pages. It's not got that many questions per page, of only 5, and not that many conditions, so it'll condition every other page. NCDS is kind of like the average study. This started in the 50s, so older than Alsbach. It's got an average rate of entry, it's got less pages, it's got slightly more questions, and it's got a condition about every page. And then the Blue study, which is represented by NSHD, started in the 40s, so it's the oldest of the 3. And it's also the slowest, with only 1 page per day. It's got a lot less pages, but it's got a huge amount of questions per page of 17 on average. And a lot more conditions, or 3 conditions per page. And this is examples of what they look like in reality. So this is the RED study, which is the fastest, and here we've got Understanding Society and Alsbach as an example. The Yellow study, which is the average one, and here we've got NCDS and SWS as pages and examples. There's more questions and there's the odd condition in there. And then we have Blue study, which examples we have NSHD and BCS. And you can see there they've just crammed everything on the page. There's loads more questions, loads more conditions, statements, sequences, everything. And some doodles as well to keep you entertained. So some conclusions. So manual entry can produce high quality and consistent metadata to the DDI standard. Staff time is the biggest expenditure, so it's important to invest in the right people and the tools. It's labour intensive, but the standard is expected, and it will mean that your data is more discoverable. So this data is expensive to collect, so the more reuse that we can get out of it, the more cost effective it will be. Questionnaire design significantly affects the speed of entry and varies greatly between the studies. I would say don't put off entering legacy metadata, as the problem will only increase over time. And invest in documenting questionnaires as early in the process as possible. So if you're designing questionnaires, design them in DDI. And then lastly, the software and documentation that I've mentioned is available to use and to share. And there's some links. Thanks.